Hi there, this is Dr. Laura Jones, and today I'm going to be talking to you about mold toxicity and mold-related illness. The objectives of this video are to let you know what is mold-related illness, what are the symptoms that may be due to mold-related illness, and what are the mechanisms of that illness. Lastly, we're going to talk about assessments that can be made to look for mold toxicity in patients. So let's start with a refresher to remind us a little bit about mold basics. As we all learned about in high school biology, molds are part of the kingdom fungi, and this is one of the most diverse and abundant eukaryotes on Earth. There are a lot of them. Mold inhabits moist places, including soil, plants, and dead decaying matter, and molds are a natural part of the environment and can be found almost anywhere that there's moisture and oxygen. In the great outdoors, mold plays a critical role in breaking down dead organic matter. However, when it's indoors, mold growth can create some very serious concerns. There are many types of mold, and all of them need water or moisture to grow. When excessive moisture accumulates in buildings or on building materials, mold growth often occurs, particularly if the moisture remains undiscovered or unaddressed. Mold growth can occur on a variety of materials: wood, paper, carpets. It actually can grow on food, as we know. It can grow on insulation in the walls of a building. It can even grow on leather. The primary indicators of dampness that may involve mold growth are condensation on surfaces or in structures such as windows, visible mold, especially if it's black mold, perceived moldy odor, poorly maintained air conditioning systems, and a building with a history of water damage, exterior leaks, wet basements, leaky plumbing. We all know how much of a problem this can create, and it's absolutely critical that these be cleaned up right away. There are 3 different types of health effects associated with mold. The 3 categories that we see are infection, which we call mycosis, allergic reactions, and then toxic effects. Mold spread by producing tiny reproductive cells called spores, and these spores travel through the air. Mold that thrives in moist environments with inadequate ventilation are going to emit spores, and then most of these mold spores are so small that they cannot be seen without magnification. They are both indoors and outdoors. And some mold spores may remain able to grow for years after they are produced. They are tough little critters. And regardless if the mold spores are alive or not, the allergens in and on them can remain allergenic for years. Mold also produces submicron fungal fragments. These are fine particles less than a micrometer in diameter, and partly because of their sneaky size and composition, they may be involved in adverse health effects, such as asthma. They are often dispersed, especially when dried mold is disrupted, and fungal fragments can remain airborne longer than fungal spores because they're smaller. And as a result, they can actually penetrate deeply into the sinuses and lungs where they're highly inflammatory. In fact, fungal fragments are more potent than spores at inducing pro-inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-6 and interleukin-8. Exposure to mold and mold fragments is correlated with a slew of different symptoms. With the information that I've presented so far, we can understand why we may see symptoms of sneezing, runny noses, red eyes, skin rashes, headaches, dizziness, and especially asthma. These are all well-accepted health concerns associated with indoor mold exposure. These risks are especially harmful for children and for our elderly population and those with a pre-existing respiratory illness. The majority of peer-reviewed published research on mold is in relation to respiratory conditions, and that research suggests that mold and damp building exposure is a major factor in our asthma epidemic. It has been estimated that 21%, or 1 in 5, of asthma cases in the U.S. are attributable to dampness and mold. One of the ways that fungal components serve as allergens actually can also trigger an IgE response that contributes to asthma development and the severity of the asthma. Some research suggests that fungi can bind to antibodies, allowing them to be recognized by cells of the immune system, including macrophages, dendritic cells, and mast cells. And in this way, fungi themselves may directly activate the immune system, or the mycotoxins that the fungi produce can trigger the immune system. So 2 different ways for it to impact us. Immune cells activated by fungi may provoke an increase in particular prostaglandins, which can lead to hypersensitivity symptoms that often involve symptoms such as chronic sinusitis, chronic bronchitis, cough, irritation of the respiratory tract and the eyes, as well as dermatitis. I mentioned that potential health effects associated with mold and mycotoxins generally fall into the categories of infection, allergic reaction, and toxic effects. It's important to elaborate some on infection. We know that the respiratory system is often the first point of contact during inhalation of mold spores and mycotoxins. Of course, this can occur through the sinuses, which seems to be an area of concern that easily goes undiagnosed. So fungal sinusitis is actually something I see quite often in my office. Unfortunately, the poor patient often has just been given another antibiotic, which worsens the condition. Fungal lung infections are another concern, which we seem to be better at identifying. And of course, this is a significant concern that needs to be addressed right away. Not only does the mold get into the lungs, and that itself causes a problem, but in vivo studies have revealed that certain mycotoxins, such as aflatoxin, slows down the respiratory ciliary beating, which actually increases the chances of a worse lung infection. In my practice, I certainly see a lot of fungal overgrowth in the gut and on the skin. While a small amount of yeast is normal in the gut, fungal dysbiosis and its negative influence on gut health is discussed in my microbiome video. We see a lot of it. Exposure of the gut to various mold and mycotoxins can create a lot of discord in there. It can create inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract, damage the intestinal barrier function, impaired secretory activity, and even altered enterocyte turnover. We may find many of our IBS patients need a little TLC to rebalance the flora in the gut, which is possible when we supplement with beneficial bacteria and work to reduce the fungal colonies in the gastrointestinal tract. Oral administration of various binders can also help reduce symptoms. And then we have fungal dermatitis, which can present as a standalone symptom or accompany a fungal dysbiosis in the gut. So these patients with dermatitis can present with exacerbation of symptoms when they're perspiring, when they're becoming warm after a bath, or even after sun exposure. You'll see the dermatitis flare, or you might even see a correlating episode of urticaria. So we talked about some of the more common symptoms that people might associate with mold toxicity or mold-related illness, some of the better accepted ones. But the relationship between mold exposure and the host immune system is still not fully understood. And there are actually many folks confident that mold-related illness extends way beyond allergies, asthma, sinusitis, and dermatitis. The most recent and intriguing research publications combine the evidence and opinions regarding the role of mold and mold toxins in the development of immune system dysfunction. And while there is acknowledgement of allergic immune responses caused by mold, other health effects caused by mycotoxins is controversially discussed. That's important to keep in mind. However, the observations of various medical researchers and healthcare providers indicate a pathological role that mold and associated mycotoxin exposure may play in individuals with pre-existing immune system dysregulation. This underlying pathology that creates a vulnerability to more significant mold illness includes allergic and non-allergic chronic inflammatory diseases, autoimmune disorders, and HIV. So let's back up for a minute and talk about mycotoxins, the components of mold that many believe are causing symptoms outside of the respiratory tract. First off, we need to recall that mycotoxins are the naturally occurring metabolites of mold. Mycotoxins are what we're going to spend the majority of the rest of this video talking about today because they're getting an awful lot of attention recently. In fact, the World Health Organization convened with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and together they created an international body referred to as JECFA. JECFA is responsible for evaluating the health risk of various natural toxins, including mycotoxins. And JECFA states, mycotoxins are naturally occurring toxins produced by certain fungi and can be found throughout our environment, including in and on our foods. They really specialize in the food piece. That's what they're looking at a lot. They review mycotoxin exposure in many populations around the world. We know that mycotoxins can cause a variety of adverse health effects, and pose a serious health threat to both humans and other animals. Some mycotoxins cross the blood-brain barrier, some cross the placenta, some are even found in breast milk. Mycotoxins can create a lot of trouble in our bodies. Some examples of mycotoxin capabilities: they are immunotoxic, they are neurotoxic, they are dermatotoxic, nephrotoxic, hepatotoxic, hepatocarcinogenic, genotoxic, tetragenic, and carcinogenic. That is a mouthful, but they can create a lot of ruckus in our bodies. To understand how humans can be so vulnerable to mold-induced illness, it's important to remember that mold can be found almost everywhere, right? Our air, our soil, our food, our plants, on several different materials throughout our workspaces and our homes, even on our animals, even on us. And many fungi absolutely live in harmony with us, rarely causing illness. However, some produce mycotoxins that are really toxic. Some produce mycotoxins that are way more toxic than others. And there are actually some species of mold that can produce several different types of mycotoxins. To date, several hundred mycotoxins have been identified through various scientific methods. And throughout the years, plant-based foods, especially those in countries that lack food quality standards and enforcement, were the predominant concern regarding food-based mycotoxin exposure. However, significant mycotoxin exposure has also occurred in developed countries. For example, even here in the US, we've had a problem with highly controlled infant food products. Additionally, health concerns related to occupational exposure to the carcinogenic aflatoxin in jobs related to agriculture has become better understood. Here in the US, we are starting to acquire more information on the health consequences related to living or working in water-damaged buildings due to the presence of mold and therefore exposure to mycotoxins. So we are gaining some ground slowly, better understanding the array of ways mold can negatively affect human health. However, we have a ways to go. Let's talk about how mold illness starts. As we discussed earlier, spore exposure is the best understood mechanism of mold-induced illness and occurs via inhalation, ingestion of contaminated food, or with skin contact. It is definitely possible for mold to trigger illness in healthy individuals, but as I said earlier, it's much more likely in people with weakened immune systems. So regardless of whether we're talking about a child with mold-induced allergies and asthma, or an adult with mold-related chronic fatigue syndrome or neurological pain, the immune system is responsible for the host-pathogen interaction that comes into play upon exposure. And the immune system is actually playing a critical part to protect us from pathogens such as mold and mycotoxins. Both the innate and adaptive immunity are involved in our responses to mold and its metabolites. With knowledge to date, it appears that these mechanisms may become dysfunctional in the presence of mold. This may cause either a hyperreactivity of the immune system due to the presence of mold itself, or it could actually cause a downregulation of immune function due to immunotoxic actions of some of the mycotoxins. Chronic exposure or large, intense exposure to mold and mycotoxin can therefore cause exacerbation of immune-related symptoms in someone with immune disease. This may present as either an underactivation of the immune system or an overstimulation of the immune response. So exposure to mycotoxins in the presence of pre-existing immune dysregulation is of particular concern, especially when we have pre-existing chronic inflammatory diseases and autoimmune disorders. So while the connection between respiratory disease, such as asthma and allergies, and mold is easily to wrap our brains around and very well documented in the literature, research in animals and humans on non-respiratory conditions associated with mold toxicity is limited. We do have some studies and a growing body of clinical research correlating with physiological dysfunction, including neurological and immunological diseases with toxins related to water-damaged buildings in particular. Campbell et al. Published their findings regarding neurophysiological abnormalities in the Archives of Environmental Health in 2003. They found that patients who were exposed to mold in their homes were not only more likely to develop neurological antibodies, but also were more likely to present with peripheral neuropathy. In fact, 91 out of the 119 patients in this study presented with peripheral neuropathy, showing significantly higher titers of IgA, IgM, IgG antibodies to neural antigens when compared with 500 healthy controls. The researchers concluded then that exposure to mold in water-damaged buildings increased the risk of neural autoantibody development, peripheral neuropathy, and other neurophysiologic abnormalities in individuals with mycotoxin exposure. In addition, the same group of patients was then included in a separate study that revealed that mixed mold mycotoxicosis, so exposure to several different molds, may be involved in the production of anti-nuclear autoantibodies and anti-myelin antibodies against the nervous system and autoantibodies against smooth muscle cells. In a study with kiddos, little children, both postural tachycardia syndrome, which is POTS, and chronic fatigue syndrome was common in those exposed to indoor air dampness or mold at schools and or at their homes, occurring in 49 out of 81% of the children, so 60%, and 56 out of 81 children, so 69% of study respondents. So 60% of them presented with POTS, and 69% of them presented with chronic fatigue syndrome. It is speculated that autoantibodies against adrenergic and acetylcholine receptors may be involved here. Due to the strong toxicity of mycotoxin and the number of cases of immune disorders and the growing number of illnesses that are tagged idiopathic, there's a growing interest in better understanding mycotoxins and mold-induced illness. So far, some things are better understood than others. There's some initial evidence that exposure to molds, mycotoxins, and water-damaged buildings may induce neurological, neuropsychiatric illness, producing chronic pain, mobility issues, and disorders of balance and coordination. The area of opportunistic fungal infections and their neurotoxic effects in ALS and Parkinson's disease continues to also be investigated, as well as clinical correlation between mold exposure, chronic fatigue, and chronic pain. So as we can see, chronic exposure or intense exposure to mold and mycotoxins is capable of creating a lot of dysfunction and chaos throughout our body. It does so through various proposed mechanisms, including depletion of NRF2, which controls an array of antioxidant responses in our body, depletion of glutathione, one of our very most protective antioxidants capable of repairing cell damage throughout the body, induction of mitochondrial damage. As you recall, mitochondrial are the powerhouses of our cells, allowing us to produce ATP, which is the fuel for our body. Mycotoxins can modify several enzymes throughout the body and the way that they function, and they can inhibit protein synthesis and inhibit our immune function by decreasing antibody-producing cells, decreasing certain antibody titers in the serum, and decreasing phagocytosis, which is how our bodies destroy foreign substances in apoptotic cells. Here is a list of the most commonly measured mycotoxins on valuable testing panels. Most of these come from mold species that thrive in similar environments, most commonly sourced from wet buildings, grains, nuts, and produce crops around the world. Most of these mycotoxins affect the same systems and organs throughout the body, most often affecting kidney and liver function, immune function, and the neurological, gastrointestinal, and reproductive systems. I will highlight just a few of the mycotoxins we have particular concern about, but will spare you from reviewing each in detail as it can become tedious to listen to. A good quality lab will have reference guides and materials to guide you through assessing results and a team of experts for consult if needed. So you do not need to be an expert to identify a patient who may need to be tested. You do not need to be an expert to order a test and perhaps make a life-changing discovery for the patient. I'd like to start with aflatoxin M1 or AFM1. This is a secondary metabolite of some Aspergillus species. It's found in various foods, especially in animal foods from animals that have consumed contaminated feed. So in particular, milk and dairy products. Other sources can be water-damaged buildings. Aflatoxin M1 is a hepatotoxic carcinogenic mycotoxin. So the World Health Organization has called it a class 1 carcinogen. It's also found in cereals, in oil seeds, in peanuts, nut butters, and meats. It's metabolized through the cytochrome P450 pathway, and it wreaks havoc in the body. It induces hepatocarcinogenesis, cell apoptosis, and reduction of ATP synthesis. It is associated with carcinogenicity, GI toxicity, hepatotoxicity. It's an immune suppressive, creates oxidative stress, neurotoxic, and produces reproductive toxicity as well. So that one is a doozy. Ochratoxin A is another mycotoxin worth talking about. This is produced by several Aspergillus species and can be found throughout the food chain, particularly on coffee, nuts, in wine, in grains, dairy. I've also found it a common finding on testing from patients who live or work in water-damaged buildings. It casts negative impacts on health through common methods seen among many of the mycotoxins, including oxidative stress, mitochondrial impairment, and genotoxic effects. OTA is the most toxic of all ochratoxins, and the kidneys are especially affected upon exposure. A third one to talk about is trichothecenes, and this is produced by several species, including Stachybotrys. Sources are materials from wet buildings, board wood, wallpaper, also contaminated grains. This mycotoxin works by inhibiting protein synthesis related to many negative outcomes in the body. Damage through inhibition of protein synthesis, increasing reactive oxygen species production, and mitochondrial dysfunction. Its health impacts are similar to the two others that I've discussed. On this slide, you'll see a list of other mycotoxins that are often included on mycotoxin panels. This slide lists a few more that affect various systems throughout the body, all acting in similar ways. There's just a couple that I would like to point out. Of note is mycotoxin ZEA, which has the ability to bind to estrogen receptors, indicating that it may influence the risk of estrogen-related cancers, but also hormone imbalance. Mycotoxin ENB is another one I'd like to point out. This is not only an endocrine disruptor, but it is able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get access to the brain very easily. For our patients that we suspect mycotoxin exposure and feel we need more details to know how to best approach their health concerns, mycotoxins can be measured through the urine with reputable labs that specialize in such. Methodology includes liquid chromatography alongside mass spectrometry. This together produces high specificity and allows for capturing unconjugated mycotoxin presence even at low levels. This is valuable because even at low levels, these mycotoxins can cause serious health concerns, and especially in our vulnerable patients. A good panel will also include creatinine levels because this is how we make sure to account for fluid intake and the amount of urine, ensuring that the results are accurate and reliable. Understanding not only which mycotoxins are elevated, but how high they are in our patients can allow a provider to better understand more about viable treatment options and the duration of treatment in order to design a treatment plan with optimal outcomes for the patient. Patients with chronic respiratory conditions certainly are those that you may want to consider testing for mold exposure, especially if they have been resistant to treatment. Clinicians assessing for mold toxicity should also take the time to interview the patient or interview the family in the case of a child for the likelihood of symptoms being caused by mold dampness, building dampness, mold exposure. Do they spend time in a home or an office building with moisture issues is one question to ask. Is mold visible anywhere in the environment that they live or work in is another important question to ask. Buildings can also measure the level of humidity in them. We can actually directly measure contaminants in the air in buildings, on surfaces, or even on dust. The various methods that are used include culture, which is one of the most affordable ways to do it. The one shortcoming of most testing, however, is that the levels that are currently in the patient do not tell us whether that's from current ongoing exposure or from previous exposure. So that's just something to keep in mind. This is also why asking a lot of questions about living and work environments is critical, and why perhaps testing of the building itself can be of value. So, speaking of value, I hope that you have found this video especially valuable today. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab they want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.